Good day, everyone. My name is Mary Texera, and I am retired from the sociology department as a professor here at Cal State San Bernardino. And we'd like to welcome you to one of over 100 programs that we've had examining the criminal justice system with a critical eye. And specifically today, we're going to look at policing in the community. I am a former law enforcement officer, so Dr. Cheng's book is it triggered a few things in me because it's so familiar. It is so familiar, Tony, and we're talking 30 years ago that I was on the LA Sheriff's Department. However, the more things change, the more they remain the same, as they say. So we're certainly looking forward to hearing from you today and about your research. And I am not going to delay because we want to get to Dr. Cheng, but I want to hand it over to my colleague, Robbie Madrigal, who will do our land acknowledgement. Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you, Mary. We recognize that California State University, San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Jeremy Murray.
Thanks, Robbie. I'm Jeremy Murray. I teach here in the history department, and I'll pass it over to Michael German.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School and formerly served as an FBI special agent. And I'll pass it to Amber.
Thank you, Michael. Peace, everyone. My name is Amber Broaden. I serve as adjunct faculty in the psychology department at both CSU Dominguez Hills and San Bernardino with a specialization in legal and forensic psychology. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker today, Tony Cheng. He is an assistant professor of sociology at Duke University. He studies the way state power is legitimized and shapes inequalities within communities. Within his book, The Policing Machine, Enforcement, Endorsements, and the Illusion of Public Input, it's about how police resist institutional reforms by cultivating political capital from the community constitutes they empower. His research has appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, Criminology, Social Problems, Law and Society Review, Criminology and Public Policy, City and Community, and Politics and Society. He has a sociology PhD from Yale University and a JD from NYU Law School. Previously, he was an assistant professor at UC Irvine's Department of Criminology, Law, and Society. Thank you, Tony, for being here today.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and try to share my screen. Okay, is that okay for everyone?
Yes, beautiful.
Okay, perfect. Let me just go ahead and move this to the side. Okay, so thank you to Jeremy, to everyone here, all the organizers of today's talk. It's a true privilege to be part of such an amazing series, and thanks to everyone as well who's in attendance. Again, my name is Tony Cheng. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Duke University, and the title of my talk, which is based on my book, is called The Policing Machine, Enforcement, Endorsements, and the Illusion of Public Input. So at the height of stop and frisk in New York City between 2010 and 2012, the NYPD was clearing well over 500,000 per year. So stop and frisk referred to this legal police practice where officers can stop a pedestrian so long as
I think you're mute, Tony. Something's happening. Can everyone hear Tony or no? Is it just
No.
me and Jeremy?
It's frozen.
Yeah.
You have to log back in.
Oh, we're back.
Oh,
Okay,
there he
okay.
is.
Did I disconnect?
Okay.
Sorry about
Here,
that.
so if
We can hear you
if you
now.
could just repeat about the last minute or so, Tony,
Okay.
I think that's where you got cut off.
Let's see. Hopefully this works. We'll try attempt number 2.
Right. How about the slide before that?
Okay. So did it disconnect again?
We can hear
I
you
still
now.
hear you. Yes.
Huh. Okay. So again, this chart shows how at the height of stop and frisk in New York City between 2010 and 2012, officers were clearing well over 500,000 per year. And so in New York City, officers were primarily stopping and frisking young Black and brown people who, as indicated by the yellow on the bottom of the chart, were shown to be overwhelmingly not in possession of any weapon. So during the same time, again, at the height of stop and frisk in New York City, thousands of community members organized and marched silently down Fifth Avenue in New York City to protest what they were referring to as an institutionalized program of racial injustice. So 3 days after the protests, the local news station WPIX 11 News invited a community member to the station for an interview. And so that individual actually expressed support for police practices like stop and frisk. And so that individual was an older African-American male named Mr. Holloway. And he explained how he had lived in Brooklyn since he was 13 years old. And while there may be some bad police officers who are still out there, the point was that because of practices like stop and frisk, people aren't walking around in fear anymore. And so I encountered Mr. Holloway during the course of my fieldwork in New York City, and I asked him, how did this interview come about? And so he explained how Commissioner Kelly, who was the NYPD commissioner at the time, had his people get in touch with me to go on to defend stop and frisk. And so in other words, the interview wasn't set up by the news station, but instead coordinated by the NYPD itself. And it was to specifically go on to TV to defend stop and frisk. And so in fact, Mr. Holloway wasn't just any normal, typical resident in the community. He was president of the 80th Precinct Community Council for well over a decade. And so community councils are these resident-run boards in every single precinct in New York City that are designed to foster police-community relationships. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, the context to this interview, the fact that it was coordinated by the NYPD and Mr. Holloway's status within the community as president of the community council, were omitted when the NYPD began circulating the interview on their Facebook and YouTube channels just a few days later. And so these types of public endorsements of police from selected community members like Mr. Holloway enable police to navigate the public sphere, especially during times of protests and controversy. And so these public endorsements take on particular significance in the current moment. So from the bottom up, the police killings of the 2010s sparked an extraordinary call to action against the ongoing harms that American policing brings to minoritized communities. At the same time, from the top down, President Biden has expressed his commitment to add over 100,000 additional community policing officers to streets across America to improve police-community relationships. And so these two represent two fundamentally opposed visions for the role of police within our communities that are nonetheless proceeding simultaneously. So in my book, The Policing Machine, I wanted to make sense of how we can have, on the one hand, the larger social protests in American history, while at the same time have the main policy response be to invest in the very thing that protesters are demanding less of. And so I specifically wanted to examine police's active role in shaping these dynamics on the ground. So I try to get at this question in my book by asking, how do police departments resist intensifying public scrutiny? My argument unfolds at both the organizational level and the individual officer level. So at the organizational level, I argue that police departments may want public legitimacy, but not at the expense of organizational independence. And so these dual institutional imperatives guide how individual officers distribute public resources, regulatory leniency, and coercive force. And they differentially distribute these things across all the different channels for public input that exist within communities. So first, officers seek to direct all community complaints toward department channels, such as police community meetings that they run and operate, because they have full control over how the complaints that are raised within them can be recorded and represented. At the same time, because not all complaints are voiced in department channels, either because people might be unaware of them or dissatisfied or for any other reason, officers must cultivate constituents outside of department channels. And so second, police aim to amplify the demands for more police services emerging out of partner channels, such as community councils that I mentioned earlier that Mr. Holloway was president of. And please amplify these voices by targeting public resources and regulatory leniency toward these partner channels. Third, throughout this time, those who remain dissatisfied with department and partner channels organize their own independent channels to voice demands for institutional change and police alternatives. And so police approach these independent channels by targeting coercive force towards them in hopes of containing their demands for police alternatives within these independent channels. And so together, these strategies position police to cultivate the endorsements needed, again, such as the one coming from Mr. Holloway that I mentioned in the introduction, to resist institutional changes. And so these strategies together are what I'm referring to as the policing machine. And so the key takeaway from the book stands in contrast to the arguments that we hear from the top down, saying that police-community relationships need to be built. It also stands in contrast to the arguments that we're hearing from the bottom up, suggesting that community relations are inconsequential, they don't matter, or they're merely a distraction. Instead, the key takeaway from my book is that the police-community relations that already exist are precisely what's impeding police transformation. And so I understand that the norm of this series is to keep the presentations down to below 20 minutes if possible. And so I'm going to briefly discuss the framework, touch on the data and methods, and then provide a quick finding before moving on to Q&A. So first, the framework around the policing machine. So on top, I have the definition of the policing machine, which refers to how police cultivate political capital by engaging in a strategic politics of distributing public resources, regulatory leniency, and coercive force. So by political capital, I'm referring to the stocks of influence that can be earned through relationships that can then be mobilized for political purposes, such as gaining power or legitimacy. And by focusing on the strategic politics of police, a key part of my argument is that we need to think about police as central actors within our urban political systems and not just criminal justice. And this will help us expand our theories about what incentives, tools, strategies, and relationships matter to police departments. So in terms of the motivation underlying the policing machine, I argue that police are legitimacy optimizers rather than legitimacy maximizers. So in other words, police may want public legitimacy, but not at the expense of organizational independence. And so we can depict that relationship as such, and we can expect police to build relationships with only the subset of the public needed in order to maintain independent decision-making over department operations. So in terms of how, I argue that police are political mobilizers, not just law enforcers. deploying a variety of tools and strategies beyond citations and arrests and other classic law enforcement instruments. And so the book emphasizes a range of tools ranging from social media posts to sound permits. And the reason why the policing machine matters so much is because it creates an illusion of public input. It establishes a social order where community preferences towards police emerge either with the stage or through struggle, depending on how it aligns with police priorities. And in doing so, police can then claim accountability to the constituents who they've cultivated from the bottom up, rather than the institutions that are designed to regulate them. So next, on to the data and methods. So this study focuses on America's largest police department, the NYPD, but rather than describing this as a study of police per se, I would more accurately describe this as a study of police through community, because the NYPD never actually granted me formal access. So over the course of months, the NYPD repeatedly denied my requests for interviews and other forms of access, either explicitly through some of the emails shown here or implicitly through silence. And this reflects the point about how institutional actors can also be hard to reach populations, though of course for very different reasons than the marginalized populations that we typically apply this label to. And so on the one hand, these denials generated the unique set of public data sources that I used to inform this study. Again, everything from sound permits to social media posts. But at the same time, I also learned that the NYPD did not deny everyone's requests for access. And so instead, they were working with institutional partners to conduct formal evaluations of their ongoing programs. And so this is not merely a methodological point, but it instantiates the core argument of the book, which is about how the police departments engage in strategic politics and relationship building under the policing machine. And so nonetheless, here are the specific data sources that I drew upon to inform this study. I'm happy to answer any additional questions about data and methods in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. So briefly, I want to focus the remaining time that I have on providing an overview of two different strategies for how police cultivate constituents in partner channels specifically. And so in a lot of ways, the issues and dynamics around partner channels are the meat of the book and probably what I find the most interesting parts of the book. So first, one strategy is to establish and build the capacity of new organizations and systems. So on the left, my left, we see a map of New York City City Council districts. And so traditionally elected officials pose problems for police departments because they're constantly threatening oversight and reform. They're threatening different accountability legislation, and they're generally unreliable from election to election. And so in New York City, as well as in many other cities such as Los Angeles, police departments have established community councils as an alternative system of neighborhood representation. And so again, Mr. Holloway was president of the community council in his precinct. And so unlike elected officials, community councils are subject to NYPD influence and control. So there are official guidelines that govern who is eligible to vote in community council elections, who can run in those elections, and essentially all other aspects of community council operations. An important point about these guidelines is that they make it quite difficult for newcomers to have influence. And so in one election that I observed, out of a precinct of 150,000 residents, only 26 people were eligible to vote for community council president. So nonetheless, unlike politicians, the NYPD can represent these community council leaders as the authentic neighborhood representatives. And so authentic is in quotes because here is the basic demographic information of one of the community council boards that I observed. And you can see the number of years that folks have held the most important positions, all 22 years, indicating the lack of turnover on these boards, as well as their ages, which skew older. And so these authentic neighborhood representatives, like Mr. Holloway, endorse the quality of current policing through the distribution of things, for instance, like the Cop of the Month awards. And so here's a tweet showing how Cop of the Month award is being distributed at a community council meeting. And so in every single precinct in New York City, in every single month, a Cop of the Month award is being distributed. So the main drawback of this strategy of building new is that organizations like community councils lack capacity and resources independent of the police department. So the precinct oftentimes provides the station as a meeting space for community council meetings. They provide transportation to and from events, and their officers would often act as volunteers for community council events like National Night Out. And so while police are very willing to provide these resources because it helps sustain and amplify the community council's position within communities and their endorsements of police, nonetheless, there is a ceiling to the amount of outreach that can be accomplished, which is directly proportional to the amount of resources that the precinct is willing to devote to these community councils. And so a second strategy is to co-opt existing community entities. So one of the most influential community entities is religious institutions. So unlike community councils, religious institutions are already endowed with resources such as administrative staff that can handle communications, as well as spaces designed for large meetings. And so most important, religious institutions also have access to faithful audiences. So every year, churches in the area that I observed hold a watch night service. So these are often the best attended services of the year and represent a tradition dating back to the night before the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, when enslaved and free African Americans secretly gathered inside of churches waiting for that moment. And so in today's time, in the neighborhoods that I observed, watch night service took a very different form, as Pastor Green explained to me. So he explained, we start service, we have praise and worship, where we do songs and praise to God, and then we do prayer, and then I have the NYPD precinct commander come up. So in other words, the precinct commander now has full access to the audience of the most well-attended service of the year. And so forming these relationships with religious institutions is valuable because police can then direct the faithful audience members toward their own department channels, such as police community meetings, which their officers run and operate. So in New York City, they've recently introduced a program called Neighborhood Policing that features police community meetings, which they call Build the Blocks. So I identified all the Build the Block meeting locations across New York City from the start of the program to Q3 of 2019. And I found that 30% of them were held in religious institutions, which is double the next most popular venue type. And again, this was across New York City. And so co-optation is facilitated by the police prioritizing clergy access and complaints. So for instance, the NYPD provides clergy with blue vests and ID cards that allow them to enter crime scenes and police precincts with ease. And in fact, clergy council members are instructed that if anyone in their church has a family member arrested, they should then call the cell phone numbers of their police contacts within the precinct who can provide information and help with facilitating access. And so keeping an eye on time I'm gonna go ahead and conclude it here. But before doing so, I did want to emphasize again the key takeaway from the book, which is about how the police community relationships that already exist are precisely what's impeding police transformation. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Just on that last point, Tony,
Yeah.
you said that these meetings and organizations, they impede police progress or change. Is that from the standpoint of us in the community, or what do the police feel about it? Is that from the standpoint of the police or the community that you're saying that it impedes progress?
Yeah, so it's so it would be my interpretation of what's going on. From the police perspective, they are cultivating constituents and endorsements to kind of affirm the demand for police services that exist within the community. And so when there are protests such as the one against stop and frisk or for other episodes of police violence, police departments can then furnish these endorsements and these evidence of support for police services in order to say that changes are unwanted by those who they are serving and protecting.
Sorry for interrupting. I want to just very quickly welcome Daniel Gascon, who's joining us from UMass Boston. And I had emailed Daniel Gascon about this event a couple of weeks ago and said, hey, do you want to join us? And then it slipped my mind to tell everybody that he was going to be here and he's going to help us host and moderate this event. So that's my fault. Daniel, I thank you so much. And I know, Mike, you're ready with some questions. So please join me in welcoming Daniel, and thanks everybody. My apologies for letting that slip my mind.
Great, thank you. Professor Cheng, what you describe in the takeover of or the NYPD influence over these community councils is what in other contexts is sometimes called regulatory capture, right? When an entity that's supposed to regulate an institution starts to serve the interests of the institution rather than the interests of the public that it serves. And you described two ways of doing it. One was the co-opting of existing councils or existing structures, and the other is creating new ones. And that's the one I'm interested in creating, particularly the criticism that the existing ones are already co-opted. How long would it take from creating a new one to when the institution would be able to co-opt that regulatory entity as well? Or how would it go about that?
So let me know if I'm answering the question sufficiently, but
Sure.
So I guess in New York City, at least, and that's the area that I know the most, that I'm most familiar with. So in terms of creating new, the first strategy, the NYPD helped establish the community councils themselves. So they are the ones who help design how community councils should operate. I think they date back to the 1940s when they were supposed to be originally designed to help deal with juvenile delinquency at that time. But over time, they have grown to represent, they're supposed to be a resident-run board that facilitates police community relationships. And again, those guidelines that are issued by the NYPD controls every aspect of community council operations. And so when conflicts of interest arise, essentially the NYPD has final say over how things should proceed. And so in terms of controlling those community councils, they exercise what I would consider direct control rather than regulatory capture, because they were created by the NYPD itself. So there wasn't as much of a need as for capturing because they were created by the agency. But then in terms of the clergy councils, in contrast, I think co-optation happens slowly through giving them priority access to NYPD resources and things like that. Through those mechanisms, co-optation proceeds over time. But let me know if I'm answering that question sufficiently.
Yeah, and I guess that was the question. And maybe a better way of framing it is just how do you suggest reforming this system? In other words, if the existing structures, both the ones that exist that are a direct creation of the NYPD and the ones that existed in the community that the NYPD co-opted, how would creating a new oversight mechanism work that would be more effective than the existing ones?
Yeah, so I'm incredibly skeptical about oversight mechanisms, and I'm happy to talk more about my skepticism. But I think a lot of it has to do with, on the one hand, there's not enough research on what exactly these oversight boards or mechanisms should look like. But at the same time, I'm skeptical that it's an issue of design, where if only we could design the best mechanism or oversight board, then the problems with policing could be solved or alleviated. Instead, the proposals that I talk about in the book are specifically about how individual residents can resist what I'm referring to as the policing machine, or how cities should demonopolize the policing machine. Again, I'm skeptical of regulatory boards, and I'm also skeptical or find it less worthwhile to propose things that the police department should stop doing, just because I think it's rational for police departments as an organization to engage in the practices which I'm referring to as the policing machine. And so in terms of policy recommendations, I'm specifically focused on what individual residents can do or what cities should do. And I'm happy to go into detail about those if that's helpful.
Sure, I think that would be helpful, and particularly, typically the communities that are most dissatisfied, both in the services they receive or don't receive from the police department, but also in the abuses, tend to be under-resourced already. So how would you get resources to those communities?
Yeah. So I guess from the community's perspective, I think it's a real struggle because especially for the community activists that I talked to and interviewed as part of the study, they talked about how disengagement with the strategies of the policing machine, so not attending the police community meetings, even though they might be a waste of time, it's risky because that's exactly what the policing machine is designed to do, where if activists are not attending those meetings and not challenging what officers are saying, for example, then the policing machine is facilitated and strengthened. And so disengagement with the strategy of the policing machine is risky. And then as you say, residents do want services and they do want protection and other city services. And so the strategies that I observed residents pursuing, regardless of whether they wanted more or less policing, had to do with things like pursuing services from non-police providers. So for example, many of them pursued services from the district attorney, for example, and prosecutors who were also interested in building relationships with the community. Those who were still skeptical or uncomfortable with building relationships with criminal justice entities also then sought to develop ways to reestablish democratic oversight over the police department, not through boards and community institutions exactly, but rather through providing evidence, collecting evidence, and providing that evidence to elected officials in order to pressure them and empower them to act in ways that they wanted. So, for example, in the police community meetings I observed, as police officers, as community officers were disregarding the complaints that individuals were raising in those meetings, then those who got increasingly frustrated began documenting their own complaints that the officers were promising to solve but weren't. And then they gave that evidence and information over to their local elected officials, who could then apply pressure for police departments or other entities to act and provide the services that they were looking for. And then, of course, other folks in the community also formed non-state protective services, such as tenant associations, that could provide protection to different people in times of need, as well as other types of strategies.
Thank you. Professor Gascon, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Tony, great job on the book. I really enjoyed reading it. I did have a question, though, especially since you brought up this sort of challenge of getting at police actors throughout your course of the study. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about sort of social media as a key informant, and what were some of the benefits that you saw from working with social media data, and what were some of the challenges? I mean, because especially during COVID, I taught an ethnography class that was digital ethnography, so I kind of became aware of how this is kind of becoming a more of a salient approach to ethnographic work. So because it jumped out at me in your work, I was just curious to hear a little bit more about your experience with it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and thank you for joining, and great seeing you again. So I think, in terms of social media data, that came into play in the study in two different ways. First, obviously after being denied access to the NYPD, I began looking for other data sources that might be informative and provide insight into the organization. And so obviously the NYPD was posting a lot on social media, just like any other policing agency, and frankly, any other organization and individual does these days. So I saw how the NYPD was posting different summaries of the meetings that they were holding with community members. And they were summarizing the types of complaints that were being voiced in those meetings. And so that led me to think about how I could trace, how accurately those depictions were compared to, the actual discussions that were going on in the meetings. And so then I began to think about if I could trace the types of complaints that were being voiced by residents in the meetings themselves versus those that are recorded in organizational documents that I requested through Freedom of Information Act requests, and then how they're being ultimately represented online to the mass public. And so comparing those different complaints and tracing them across these different spaces revealed how the individual officers were either omitting certain types of complaints, those that critique the police department, or were transforming complaints in ways that represented endorsements of police services. And the second way that social media came into play was through what I'm referring to as digital omissions. And so it's an interesting experience where if you go to one of the police community meetings and see how, versus seeing how it's represented on social media, sometimes those are vastly different experiences where, I would attend a meeting, it wasn't that well attended, but then I go home and see the NYPD post a picture of the meeting and it looks incredibly well attended and not something that, not the way that I remembered it or recalled it. And so like any other, actor or organization, there are strategic representations of real world events that are happening online. And so I think social media is particularly valuable to the NYPD and to the policing machine because it guarantees that a implicit endorsement can be claimed from any community event or exchange. So even if a meeting is not well attended, social media allows the police department to represent it in such a way that it suggests that the meeting was, very productive. Lots of people there. They asked and requested for more police services, and the like. And so social media does facilitate through strategic concealment and omissions. It does facilitate these types of implicit endorsements of the police department. And the drawback, of course, is that without access to police departments themselves and those who might be the actors who are specifically posting the content, it's a little bit difficult to get a sense of the intentions behind certain posts.
Thank you. There's a lot of great questions in the Q&A, but Mary, I saw you had your hand up for a brief moment.
No, please go ahead with the questions, Michael, and I'll ask mine if we have time at the end.
Okay, great. Adrian Amador has a question. She says, as a law enforcement oversight employee in New York City, in other words, she's identifying herself that way, are you speaking only of independent oversight boards rather than oversight entities that operate at a government level? And she's saying there is a distinction between the two. What are your thoughts on legislation evolving in Florida at present?
So I'm not familiar with the legislation in Florida specifically, though if any additional information can be provided, happy to talk about it, or try to provide some initial thoughts. But in terms of independent oversight boards rather than appointment oversight entities that operate at the government level, so I'm not entirely sure about that distinction either. So in New York City, I'm familiar with the Civilian Complaint Review Board, the CCRB, which I'm not sure if they're considering that as a independent oversight board or as an appointment oversight entity. Perhaps some clarification on the
I think the issue is whether these are government employees who are assigned to do an oversight role versus community organizations like the council.
Oh, I see. So yeah, so the types of boards that I observed were resident run. They were residents who volunteered their time, participated in an election, and then were elected by community members who were eligible to vote to serve on the board. And so the argument there is that even though this is supposed to be a mechanism for democratic oversight and local control over the police department, that the police department has managed to influence and control these community councils in ways that render them not effective.
Interesting. And another question is from Deborah Logan, says, do the community councils think the police department is responsive to their input, or are they just sucked into police politics and then just comply with what the police directives are?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you again for the question. Something that I want to make and hope to make clear is that everybody who I talked to in the study, all the folks who I interviewed and I observed, were all very well aware of their position within the community, of the strategies that I'm referring to as the policing machine. Mr. Holloway, who was an older African-American male who I talked about in the introduction, was very well aware of his role within the community and the power of his voice, even when he endorsed police practices. And so Mr. Holloway, from his perspective, as president of the 80th Precinct Community Council, wanted police services and thought that him being president and providing endorsements when the police wanted them was his way of getting, building up his own types of political capital in order to get police services that his constituents would find helpful. And so the argument, I guess the argument, while it's critical of police and is an explanation for why why different reforms and transformations of police departments are hard to achieve. It does not try to pass judgment on whether whether it's wrong to want more police services or whether it's good to want less police services.
And Professor Gaston, I don't know if that's another question you have.
Yes. So I had another question about the historical elements of neighborhood policing in the way that you talk about it. So, I was kind of trained in, I don't know how to put my hand down here, but here we go. I was kind of trained in the tradition of writing genealogies and street histories. So I guess I wanted to know a little bit more about the historical backdrop of that program locally. You kind of give us a sense that police machines, at least that term, has been in existence since the late 60s. And I was just super interested. I wanted to know more about that discussion, how far they had come, whether that had been a kind of consistent policy thread historically or not. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, if you had a sense.
Yeah. So let's see. So neighborhood policing in New York City started specifically after the murder of Eric Garner. So it's a recent program, and it is the city's most recent iteration of a long history of community policing programs that have evolved over time. Neighborhood policing is just the most recent version of different types of community policing programs in New York City, but also in other cities where there are slight changes in how there are slight differences in how the programs are administered, but essentially they oftentimes feature neighborhood coordination officers or community policing officers who would be assigned specific districts or precincts or geographic areas. And they would hold different community meetings where people are invited to come and voice different complaints. And then there are times in past commissions and even past scholars. I think Wes Gogan had a line in one of his books where he talks about how he joked about how whether community policing is the new political machine. And so I think scholars especially have mentioned or have toyed with the idea of whether there is some sort of machinery behind community policing. But from my understanding, no one has taken that metaphor as seriously as I try to do in the book, where I try to argue that rather than a classic political machine where the police department is kind of an agent who's trying to pursue electoral victory for elected officials. Instead, the policing machine is a set of strategies that enables the police departments to cultivate political capital to resist institutional reforms. So I try to take that metaphor seriously in the book and see how far I could go with it, to try to talk about the political police departments as a political organization.
Thank you. And another question from the audience. Patrick Litke asks, do you think the co-opted or controlled institutions are actually increasing the trust of police in a broader section, or are they just concentrating the supportive elements in one place? And does that matter, particularly as it might create obstacles to true independent oversight?
I think I think in general, it's the question of how to measure and track community sentiments towards police and other criminal justice agencies is a really difficult thing to do because there's no infrastructure really designed to track community sentiments like we do crime statistics, which is something that cities should invest in terms of tracking community sentiments towards different agencies like police departments. But nonetheless, putting that aside, that's a quite difficult thing to do, as a measurement issue. I think the argument behind the policing machine is that police departments prefer, people to sort into different channels of public input, such that so the argument is that they would prefer to direct all community complaints towards department channels which they run and operate because they have full control over how the complaints are recorded and represented. But outside of those department channels, then they prefer to hold, to co-op or to cultivate constituents out of partner channels, and they could direct resources and regulatory leniency towards those and empower those partner channels, versus independent channels where they're demanding police alternatives. Police departments can then direct coercive force towards containing those complaints for police alternatives within independent channels. And so the police machine is further strengthened as people sort into different channels, and they could direct different types of strategies towards controlling the different types of input that might emerge out of those different channels. And so as people, for example, drop out of partner channels and join independent channels, that perfectly aligns with the goals of the police machine because they could more easily direct coercive force towards containing complaints for police alternatives within independent channels.
Fascinating. We have an anonymous question. To what extent do you think the focus on law enforcement-based solutions to gun violence, as opposed to other prevention measures, helps demobilize people who would otherwise favor police reform? And I would almost expand that question to your example of the media reaching out to a person selected by the police to represent the community. How much does the media sensationalization of crime contribute or empower the police machine?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm going to try to reread the question.
So it's to what extent do you think the focus on law enforcement-based solutions to gun violence, as opposed to other prevention measures, helps demobilize people who would otherwise favor aggressive police reform? In other words, people who want to do something about gun violence and are interested in the contributing to the discussion, which is primarily focused on law enforcement solutions, demobilized from broader police reform measures.
Yeah. So it's interesting that that point is raised because the clergy council that I observed in the communities that I did fieldwork in were specifically mobilized around gun violence prevention and gang violence prevention. So they organize, for example, mothers who have children who have been victims of gun violence and gang violence, and so they are very complementary to the interests of the police department, as a organized entity that is mobilized around gun violence. What's interesting enough is that even though they organize mothers against gun violence, mothers whose children have been victims of police violence, in contrast, are not part of those groups. And instead, they are more aligned with the community organizers demanding police alternatives. And so I think that is an indicator of the different ways in which gun violence and those mobilizing around gun violence can be co-opted or an arm of the policing machine. And I think going to the question about media, so media definitely has so obviously historically the mass media prioritizes and privileges the perspectives of state actors such as police departments, and they have historically built strong relationships with police departments and promote narratives even in the aftermath of police violence. I think increasingly though, as episodes of police violence become increasingly controversial or circulated, media has oftentimes become critical of police departments. And so in these instances, social media provides a powerful tool for police departments to provide unfiltered information directly to the public in a way that bypasses traditional media gatekeepers in very much the same way that activists can use social media to empower themselves and promote their voice directly to the public. I think police departments are doing the same exact thing and taking advantage of those attributes of social media to promote their narratives strategically in the public sphere as well.
Great. I wonder if you're familiar with a federal counterterrorism program called Countering Violent Extremism. It sort of operated in the same way on a national scale and also involved police departments, where the concept of it is to develop community voices that cooperate with the government interests. And it strikes me that the way you see this as an illustration of the police machine, that the police machine is operating in a larger ecosystem that has other political interests and political support. So where how much of this is just dividing the community? If we can select certain people that will allow some access to, that also creates friction within the community. So it sort of divides the community into the good ones who are cooperative with law enforcement and the suspects who aren't cooperative. Did you come across that same kind of purpose behind the way that police act in these situations?
Yeah, so it's interesting because so obviously again I didn't have access to specific officers, so I had less of a sense of their specific intentions or at least direct evidence of their specific intentions. But at the same time, I of course was able to observe the consequences of their decisions. And so it's fascinating to see how in different types of spaces within communities, there was very little overlap of people's worlds. So those who, and so in one of the neighboring precincts from the one that I observed, there was a NYPD killing of an individual named Sahid Vassal around the time that I was doing field work. And there were several nights of protests in the precinct in Brooklyn, calling for police transformation because of what they saw as a unjustified police killing. But when I asked the folks like Mr. Holloway about his thoughts about the protests and about the shooting, he never even heard of the shooting. And he never even heard of the protest, even though it happened in the precinct right next to the one I was observing. And so in terms of dividing the community, it was interesting to see how little overlap there was between between the social world and the kind of political worlds of different community members, where some didn't even know about the most pressing issues that others were experiencing.
And did it create hostility in the community towards these councils or the members of these councils?
Yeah. So at least from the perspective of the community organizers, they would cite instances like that, and as evidence of the community councils being, out of touch. Again, they were primarily comprised of older folks in the community, and them not being involved in issues of police violence really decreased the legitimacy of these councils in their eyes. Which again is a dilemma because while some of them, discounted the role of community councils within communities and said that they are a waste of time, they're just parrots of the police department, for example. At the same time, not attending those community council meetings, allows the policing machine to operate as the police department wants it. And so, that was a dilemma that I think a lot of community organizers are still struggling with, how to divide their time and things like that.
Yeah, great. Well, I know we're running short of time, but I really appreciate the research that you've done and for sharing it with us all. So thank you very much, Professor Cheng and Mary.
Thank you so much.
I just have, if you don't mind, just take a minute or so to sort of underscore what you're saying. And I love the fact that you have mentioned several times now that these are older people in the community who sit on these councils. And I certainly saw that in my own career. But the people they focused on who are some of the most powerful Black people in the community, and those are ministers. They gave each minister an honorary badge where they would, because there was no organized council per se, like what you're talking about, but they gave them a badge, and so they would let them go on death notices. For example, if someone was murdered in the community, they would call a minister and say, come with us. And, it gives them some prestige and power. They gave them access to the station whenever they wanted to go to the station. So these were, I think they eventually took the badges away because the LA Sheriff's Department was giving out a lot of honorary badges, to rich people in Malibu and that kind of thing. So that they were very, very focused though on these powerful people. And you could not go to church on Sundays and hear an anti-police message or a sermon. You didn't hear it because these folks had been co-opted. And this is another term that we've used several times today is the co-opting. There was the Sheriff's Athletic League where you had mostly Black officers who were coaching kids. You had the explorers at the station who were, thinking of careers in law enforcement. So there were all of these folks that they identified and tapped as friends of the police. And one of the other really powerful things they did was to co-opt the older Black women in the communities. They would have luncheons occasionally for our officers, and the officers would stop by when they were on patrol, and they would get something to eat, and they would schmooze with these older people in the community. So you don't, and I think the conclusion in the 1980s as well as today is they're not doing anything to change the face of policing in the community. These are older people who vote, and a sheriff in most counties in the United States is an elected official. So you've got to get the voters. So that changes, that sort of changes the goals somewhat, because you're trying to recruit voters. But I appreciate that you're seeing the same things, sort of in a different form than I saw in the 1980s, where there was a concerted effort to co-opt powerful actors in the community. So thank you very much. I would just underscore what what Michael said. I appreciate your research. And so where do you think you're going to go with that, with the research? What's going to happen policy-wise?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. But so do you mean like what concrete policy recommendations am I gonna advocate for, or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what is ideally what would be the outcome of your research? What's the end game here?
So yeah, so at the broader level, I hope that the framework around the policing machine allows different individuals across communities to see, to provide a framework and a vocabulary for understanding what might otherwise seem like disparate practices and strategies as a more collective, organized effort with particular consequences in terms of resisting institutional reforms. More concretely, in terms of policy, I think the one thing that I didn't mention in today's talk, but I kind of make a big deal about in the book, about how police departments, about how the NYPD differentially gives out sound permits to different events. And so as you can imagine, those that are either mobilizing for gun violence or trying to build and advocate for the unity between police and community, those organizations receive extreme leniency towards their events. They don't have to apply for sound permits. The police department helps, tow away cars to help clear the event. They get a lot of regulatory perks in terms of holding their public events. In contrast, those who are organizing vigils for victims of police violence, those who are protesting police practices, have to jump through a lot of regulatory hoops in order to hold their public events. And so an easy, concrete, or a very concrete thing that I think cities should be doing is to get police departments out of the business of regulating public events, or at least providing the permits for public events. Because there's a clear conflict of interest whenever any event arises that is critical of police departments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think unless we have other questions, I think we are going to free you from Zoom today, Professor Cheng, and we so appreciate, like my colleagues are saying, I'm suggesting that you are more than welcome to come back for your next book, and we appreciate your being here today. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for the questions and the engagement. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to be here today.
Thanks.
Thank you.